Hi, friends. Welcome to the Genesis of Shame podcast. I'm your host, Sam Landa, and I'm here to help you speak biblical truth to the shame you experience in relationships. My hope is that you grow in your understanding of how shame impacts you so you can learn how to connect with God and others. If you've experienced fear, hiding who you are, boundary issues, anxiety, and/or depression in your relationships, then this podcast is for you. It's time to speak truth to your shame. All right, everyone, welcome back to the Genesis of Shame podcast. And as you guys have seen for the last couple of weeks, and I kind of took a little break from talking about church abuse and the effect on the church, the effect on people, and the effect on the survivors. So it's a very difficult topic, as many of you know, so I understand that there are many who are going to be listening and having questions or may want to know more about the topic. And again, the reason why I talk about these difficult topics is because I don't think that we are addressing it, and I think it does need something to be spoken about. But today is real special because we're going to gain perspective from someone who has actually experienced it and who has gone through it and is going to give us some advice and share her story. And I'm really excited to have Sandy Zirkman here with us today. And Sandy is a victim advocate, and she has also written a book, Let Me Pray Upon You. And I'll add that to the links at the end of the when you guys see the post. And I'm excited to have Sandy here. Sandy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah. Sandy, obviously this is a difficult topic. And one of the things that I want for the audience to know, just to know a little bit about you.
I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. I've lived here all of my life. I'm married with 2 children and 2 perfect granddaughters. I serve on the Council on Child Abuse. I have spoken in a courtroom on victim advocacy, and I've done a lot of work in prevention, talking about prevention as well as my own story. I've spoken at the Christian universities and in front of church groups. And my goal in all of that is not only to help other victims, because I think when we hear each other's stories, it empowers us and helps us on our own healing, but also to educate those. As you said earlier, sometimes we don't always know what to look for, or we're not understanding what the real dynamics of clergy sexual abuse are. And so that was one of the reasons I also wrote the book.
And what has the reception been like? Because obviously, I think at first, maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was a little bit more taboo, but now within the last 5 to 10 years, it's been just opening up doors after doors for how many stories we hear about this.
It's certainly easier in the sense that we do now have a forum to talk about this. We have Facebook, and there's different people who will share so that victims know they're not alone. But it's still difficult for victims to come forward and tell their stories and to out their perpetrators for a variety of reasons, which we can get into. In my own case, I didn't tell anyone for 27 years. So I kept it secret from my husband, all my friends that didn't know. And it was a trigger factor. And I talk about that in the first chapter of the book, what really sent me to finally decide that I needed to tell someone and find my way of healing, because this was guilt and shame I was carrying for 27 years.
Wow. And I can imagine carrying that burden and carrying that weight, being stressful and creating a lot of tension just internally, right? I mean, trauma itself has an effect on the body. So I can't even imagine what that's been like.
So my story is that my abuse began when I was 16. I started attending church when I was about 8. My parents did not go to church, but my best friend asked me to go with them one Sunday, and I did, and I fell in love with church. From the time I was 8 years old, it was a place I loved being. I went to church camp. I was in vacation Bible school. As I got older, I sang in the choir. I taught Sunday school. I led church retreats. I mean, it would be no stretch of imagination to say if the doors were open, I was there. When I was 13, I was baptized. And from that point on, church became more important to me, and my faith began to deepen, and I was very spiritual in my life. Just after I turned 16, our church hired a new youth pastor, And he was totally different than any pastor we'd seen before. He was very charismatic. He was dynamic. He had wonderful sermons. He was married and had 2 children, but he really acted more like the kids. He wore cut-off jeans. He had sideburns. He drove an orange convertible. He just, in the 70s, you would call him hip. And that's what he appeared. When he came to our church, he totally changed the dynamics of the church. He had new ideas. The church was growing. There was just a new vibrancy with this new youth pastor. And I was so involved in the church when he came that he tapped into me to be one of the leaders, which was no surprise to anyone. So I was the song leader, and he was always having me serve on committees. And I was thrilled because, first of all, I liked having the attention. I felt like I was serving God. And he was somebody that people were drawn to him. They wanted to be around him and they wanted to please him. So if he asked you to do anything, people were willing to do it no matter what it was. And it was almost like a cult-like type thing. So anyway, he was there for about 6 months, and there was a youth group meeting in my home. He waited for everyone to leave, and he walked up to me and said to me how wonderful I was and what a nice job I had done for the service that night and how proud he was of me and how much I was helping him. And then he bent down and he kissed me. And it was just kind of this light kiss. And I remember standing there feeling stunned because I think he just kissed me, but this is my youth pastor and he wouldn't be doing anything he shouldn't be doing. So I felt really confused. And then I felt bad for even thinking that what he did was wrong. So I thought, well, this is just his way of showing appreciation. And I didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about it. Now, I babysat for his family. His wife worked evenings.
Prior to that event or afterwards?
Both, prior and after.
Okay.
So this gave him access to me in a way that he wouldn't have normally had because his wife worked evenings. So she would leave and then he would come home. And instead of taking me home right away, he'd want me to sit and talk about the Bible. We'd sit and talk about church, which seemed very natural to me. So that continued. And then the kissing became more frequent. It became a little bit more passionate. And again, I didn't know what to do with it. So I didn't do anything with it. I just let it happen. And I rationalize it by thinking, well, kissing's not really a sin and he's not really doing anything he shouldn't be doing really wrong. So I'm okay. This went on for a year. And I call that the grooming process, where he continually supported me. My parents were divorced, so my father wasn't in my life. So I talked to him about that a lot. I mean, he was just somebody that I thought I could trust, and he seemed to care about me. But within a year, he got to his ultimate goal of having sex with me. And that chapter in the book is one of the hardest chapters for me to write. And it's probably a difficult chapter for people to read as well. But once that happened and he crossed that boundary, everything changed. I mean, I knew then this was wrong, but I didn't know I didn't know what to do with it. And he said to me, you can't tell anyone. If you tell anyone, I'll be in trouble. You're going to be in trouble. And then he began to tell me this was God's will and that we were married in God's eyes. I mean, and I'm 16, 17 years old. So, and I trust this man. And again, I don't know what else to do. And I can remember he'd say to me, you can't tell anyone. No one's going to believe you. And I think, I don't even believe this is happening to me. How would anybody else believe? And he was so loved in the church and everyone looked up to this man that I knew even if I thought this was wrong and that I could tell someone, it would totally destroy them. I assumed it would be, the end of the church. So I kept this secret. Now, as it went on, he started to become violent. His personality totally changed. I was no longer wonderful. I was no longer perfect in his eyes. He became emotionally abusive. He became physically abusive to me. And so this went on for 5 years, from the time I was 16 till I was 21. There were times when I tried to get out of the relationship, but he would respond in one of 2 ways. One, he would become loving and very caring, tell me how much he needed me. He played the guilt trip that I needed to help the church, and this was the way we were helping the church. Or he would become very violent. He would say to me, you're a virgin, no one else is going to love you. I'm the only one that knows how to love you, and you're never going to be able to leave. And that was repeated to me over and over to a point that I began to believe that I had no way out, and that the only way this would ever end is if he were to say it was over. However, there were, at 5 years into this, 2 people in the church kind of became suspicious And so they followed him one night and found us together in a hotel room. And that started the process of basically trying to protect him and move him to the next church without anyone finding out what had actually occurred. But if you're familiar,
this was what they tried to do.
Yes. So,
oh my gosh,
if you can imagine in church life, but in anywhere where there's a group of people, rumors start flying, gossip starts happening. So it was determined that he would at least address the congregation. And all he said was, I've sinned against my wife, I've sinned against God, and I ask your forgiveness. And that was all he said. I was told by the elders where to sit in church. I was told who I was to talk to. I was told not to tell my parents, which I didn't. I listened to the elders. And so there was a cover up in an effort to protect him and move him to the next church. He did get moved to the next church. And then approximately 2 months after that, I was called in by the elders, 2 of them, that because of my behavior, I was to leave the church. And I was devastated. It is still difficult for me to talk about that part of the story because I loved that church. It was my whole life. It was the church I'd ever known. And now I was being told I wasn't fit to worship there. And I remember thinking, he can be forgiven, but I can't. He can move on and go to another place. I have no place to go. They've thrown me out of my own church. And so that was the end of the story for me. I then just decided it was over and I was going to figure out a way to live my life. It wasn't easy. And I lived with that guilt and shame for a long time. And so that's the story in a nutshell. There's much more to it than that, obviously, but that gives you an idea of, the story itself. Certainly if you get any questions, I'd be happy to answer those about the story itself.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, this is exactly the frustration that is felt not just by me, but by many other people, hopefully, about this thing happening. The fact that even the elders stood up and tried to protect this guy after what he had done. It just shocks me. It's like it's not something that would cross my mind.
Now I'll add to the story to tell you this. They were aware this had happened before he came to our church. Right after he arrived at our church, another woman from his first church came forward and accused him of sexually inappropriate behavior. They confronted him. He said it was true, promised he'd never do it again, begged forgiveness. They forgave him, and they allowed him to remain as our youth pastor without giving any information to the congregation. And so they were aware this wasn't the first time it happened, and yet they were going to allow him to move to the next church as well. Now, I believe they did inform that church that I don't know what they told them. I was never asked questions. I was, one of the things that he said to me after he was caught was to say to me, please tell them that this had only been going on for a year. When in reality, it started when I was 16, not when I was 20. And I think he did that for 2 reasons. One, I think he obviously didn't want them to know how young I was, but he really thought in his mind, I can be forgiven for an indiscretion if it's only been going on for a year. But I'm not sure they could forgive me if they've known for the entire time he was at this church, this was going on, that they could accept that. And so following in his lead, I told them that it had only been a year, but I was never in on any conversations. I don't know what he told them. I don't know what they told the church that he went to. So often these churches will, kind of gloss it over with, well, there was an incident, or yes, something happened, but we've taken care of it. I really don't know what they said, just that he was allowed to go to the next church, which again, he committed sexual misconduct. She was probably in her early 20s. She wasn't a minor, but it was in a short time he became involved with someone else in his church.
And that seems to be the pattern of the men who do this, right? There's always some sort of history. And the idea is, and this is that balance between grace and truth, right? And I've heard this story enough where when you can extend forgiveness to someone that does something that is inappropriate, but no way will that person be put back into a leadership position where that opportunity happens again. It's just, You can't. I mean, the Bible
No,
talks about this. The Bible says not all should be teachers, right?
no.
A big
James
part
3
of
1
that.
talks about a stricter judgment. James 3:1, it's a stricter judgment for those who choose to be in that position. And they're to be shepherds of the sheep. But once,
I'm sorry, Sandy. I can hear you. Give me one sec. Something happened here. Let
okay,
me see. Um,
we are having a
there we
time.
go. Okay, there we go.
So they're shepherds of the sheep. If the shepherd devours one of the sheep, he's not a shepherd, he's a wolf. He's
Mm-hmm.
not a shepherd. So you can't change the wolf back into a shepherd because he never was a shepherd. So when you return them, you're not returning a reformed shepherd. You're returning a wolf who's disguising himself once again as a shepherd. That's what you're doing. And when you do that, there's two things that happen. So when my elders were aware of this first incident and they allowed him to become our youth pastor in spite of that, they were looking at me and they were looking at every woman in that church and saying, we're willing to risk you to give this man a second chance. God did not intend for me or anyone else to be collateral damage so that this man gets a second chance at ministry. So the second thing that happens when these men are rehired or hired when there's a history of abuse or sexual misconduct, the church is setting themselves up to a lot of legal action. So they need to be aware. You might want to forgive him and you might think it's okay to return him, but the law may see it differently if that occurs again. And let me just say this. Anytime a minor is involved, there is no discussion whatsoever. You go immediately to the authorities. You don't have an elders meeting. You don't talk about it. You immediately call the police and social services. And that, I will tell you, I talk to victims all the time. That does not always happen. Churches tend to want to circle the wagons and protect the reputation. And because people in churches tend to be benevolent, caring people, they want to believe that this man made a simple mistake and he'll be okay if we just take care of him. And that's not the case. That's not what happened.
No, definitely not. And that's the whole part of it's a narcissistic characteristic. You mentioned early on that he came in and kind of just blew everyone out of the water with his charisma and just a likable person and engaging. So all of those things. And by the way, I wonder what it feels like for you when you see this happening in other churches, right? So you have these mega church pastors,
right?
And you see kind of the same characteristics, and it worries me. I don't hear about their stories, but it worries me because it's the same profile.
The power becomes more important and the position becomes more important than the mission itself. And it's not that, the powerful people will gravitate toward powerful positions. It's not the power that necessarily corrupts. These are corrupt people who are moving toward powerful positions. And they look for places that they can find vulnerable people. And where else are you going to find more vulnerable people and hurting people than in a church? And this is, a point that needs to be made too. These men target their victims. They're not chosen by mistake, or it was just one day she was in my office and we were getting too close and she sort of flirted with me and something happened. That's not what happens.
Nope.
These men look for vulnerable girls or women. Women can be just as vulnerable. When women are in a crisis, going through a divorce, they've had a death, or they're insecure, or maybe they've had prior abuse, they are in a position of vulnerability that is so easy for someone to take advantage of them if they want to. And so these men are looking for these vulnerabilities. And that's the dangerous part of these men, because in the beginning, they look like they're helping their victim. They're counseling them. They're expressing to them how they understand them and how they care about them. And so the victim, without knowing it, is being trapped and thinks this is a wonderful, caring person. And certainly he demonstrates that in the beginning. And then it slowly and gradually becomes this grooming process where you are to a point where you don't know how not to say no to this person.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because also the vulnerability within adolescence as well. One of the things that I found because I was teaching in middle school, high school class, and when students wouldn't do well, I would you'd attribute it to, oh, they're being lazy, or they're doing this, or they're doing that. But when you dig into it some more, you find out that there's issues going on at home. So
Right.
for someone who works as a youth pastor or and working with teenagers, like they have to be hyper aware of that in order to
Exactly.
protect these kids, because they become the older brother or the
Right.
second father, right?
Mhm.
And it's just so sad.
And someone once asked me, well, what are some of the things that make a teenage girl vulnerable? I said the fact that she's a teenager. Every
Mhm.
teenage girl worries about how she looks, whether she's smart enough, whether it's, and whatever her insecurity is. But teenage girls, and just by their nature, tend to be a little insecure. So, you know, and then again, as adult women, there can be insecurities based on all kinds of things going on in their lives or in their past. Um, so and as you pointed out, their job is to not take advantage of those insecurities. So, any profession, whether it's a doctor, a teacher, a counselor, when you agree to take on the role of helping another individual, it's your job and responsibility to do that job. And when you don't, you have proven you're not fit for that position. A doctor or a psychiatrist has sex with their patients, they lose their license and they're finished because the
Mhm.
trust is broken. And they know there is a line and a boundary that cannot be crossed. And once you cross it, then you have proven by your own actions,
Mhm.
that you are not fit for that job. And certainly as a clergy person, you have even a heightened responsibility because you're representing God. You're you're you're
Mhm.
you're, you're speaking the scripture. You're the person that connects that person to God in many ways. And so for sort of someone in the spiritual world to commit sexual misconduct, it's even worse. It's
Mhm.
worse. And what it does to the victim is much worse because, as I said earlier, it contaminates our spiritual life. It contaminates church for me. I can no longer
Mhm.
walk into a church without being triggered. Sometimes
Mhm.
it's not very much. Other times it's a full-blown anxiety attack. But
Mhm.
that's the result of being abused by someone within the church, and then the church responding the way they did. Because as I
Mhm.
often said, the abuse was horrific, but had that church supported me, there may have been a different outcome.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. You're right. Um, gosh, just seeing that um makes me think about what what happened or how it affects everyone else in the process. So
Mm-hmm.
you take the biggest hit, and then people around you then take a different hit, and then it
Right.
breaks down the sides. Like, I'm curious, did you know anything that may have happened with the wife? Like, when she found out, like, did she, what happened there?
Okay, so keep in mind, she too was controlled and abused by
Sure.
this man.
Yep.
Probably not to the extent that I was, but I was at their house and saw him throw a book at her and hit her in the back of the head.
Oof.
I saw many arguments between them, and I felt bad for her. I mean, I
Mhm.
did. I was in this twilight zone of a world that I was living in. I mean, I had no one I could talk to. I didn't think I could talk to anyone, and so she was sang in the choir with me. I mean, there was an incident where we were sitting in the choir practice. She's sitting next to me. My abuser walks up the aisle of the church and says to the choir director, I need to see Sandy a minute in my office. I go back to his office. He has sex with me on his desk and walks me back to the choir practice where I sit next to his wife. I mean, I'm mortified, but this was the kind of person he was. So
Mhm.
she moved to the next church because keep in mind, she's got 3 small boys. This is her marriage. She's trying to hold it together. He's controlling her as well. She moves to the next church. He then commits sexual misconduct again. And at this point, she divorces him.
Mm.
And then, of course, I lost track of both of them after that. I don't know what happened and where they went. But I did, after I had kind of decided that I needed to tell my story to my best friend, and then I eventually told my husband, there was a part of me that just felt like my healing would not be complete unless I could confront him.
Mm.
And so I hired a private investigator and I found him ministering in a church in Alabama. And I confronted him. And the results weren't what I wanted, but I'm
Mhm.
glad I had that opportunity because so many victims don't. or
Mm-hmm.
they're not capable of doing it. And so for me, it was a need and a necessity, and I'm glad that I did it. And so I did. I confronted him. Now, about a year after that, I was able to go back to my former church, and I requested a meeting of the elders.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't there at the time, but everyone remembered this story. I mean, this was a big blow up in the church, of course. I mean, most everybody did, not everyone. And so they were gracious enough to give me that meeting. And that was really healing for me, because it was important for me to address that church, to say, what you did to me was wrong. And I have every right to be back in this church. And they were very gracious to me. They were sorry for what had happened. They welcomed me back. And so that was, for that church to be able to do that was important. Then soon after that, I used the same investigator and located his ex-wife, because it's not that I was responsible for what happened in their marriage, but I wanted to at least acknowledge her pain, and that it must have been difficult for her, for whatever part I played in that. She couldn't have been any kinder and any nicer to me. I mean, she had every right to just yell, do whatever she wanted to me. And I was ready to take that, but she didn't do that. He was so kind and so just loving to me. And I was so happy for that opportunity. And we have since met several times and kept in contact. And I've often said that is a perfect example of Christian forgiveness, and someone who had every right to be angry at me, but understood that what was done to me was not my fault. And I'm so grateful to her for that. So she remarried and is very happy now. To answer your question in a long way.
No, that's really good to hear that she was able to move on from that, and just for you to go back and have those conversations, those difficult conversations, because you're right, that opportunity doesn't come to everyone, but also when it does, then it's just, building up the fortitude to actually have those conversations, which is hard.
And it was very difficult. I had made the decision to confront him. I located him, like, I think in May, June, and I arranged the meeting through my investigator for October. Now, it is a funny side note. I think it's funny. I just randomly picked October 24th. I said, it's a Sunday. That's the date we're picking. He kind of balked at that, and I insisted that someone from the church be there as well. And he said, well, the problem with that date is that's Minister Appreciation Day. So I was like, I picked Minister Appreciation Day to confront my abuser, who was still a minister. But I said, I don't care what day it is. This is the day, because I was so nervous about doing this. Once I had made my mind up to do it, I couldn't make any change. I said, it's going to happen on that day. And so that's the date that I met them. And then in the book, I described that meeting, and there's some other things that were kind of ironic that occurred. But I was happy that I was able to do it, but I was extremely nervous. And mostly, I have to say, I was mostly afraid of walking into that room and being 16 all over again. And that he would be able to manipulate me, that I would feel sorry for him, which is what he tried to do. He started talking about all the things that he had been going through and the problems that he had. And it never was about me. Never was about me.
You read right through it.
I did. So at one point he said to me, not for my sake, but for your sake, you need to forgive me. And I had already kind of anticipated that he might go there. So I had prepared a list of about 20 things that I wanted him to read to me that he had done to me. And I said to him, I can't forgive you if you don't understand what you've done to me. I mean, I just don't, so I had him read the list, and he read it to me. He read it without emotion, said he didn't remember all of it. But he read the list, and that was about it. And then my husband spoke, and I had a friend who came. So the meeting was interesting, to say the least. And I'm so thankful that I was able to have that meeting with him.
And when did you have that meeting, Sandy?
2004.
Okay.
And he remained. So his boss is sitting there. And I met with his boss the following day, expressing my concern that this man, not only was he still in the ministry at this church, but no one had any idea of his past. This is even after admitting in our meeting that he'd had many, many incidences throughout his ministry. And it wasn't until a few years ago that he got counseling and had been identified as a sexual addict, which I'm thinking, how is a sexual addict an appropriate place for a pastor in a church? So his boss was very nice to me, but basically blew me off. Said, we believe in change. We believe he's a wonder. But again, he's at this church. People are coming in. Money's coming in. He's a great speaker. Everything that I saw there was just a repeat of what I had seen in my former church. And they weren't going to do anything. They weren't going to do anything. And they didn't. And he's still, I think he's semi-retired now, but he's still in good standing. So he can do, when preachers go on sabbatical or whatever, he can still in, and he still has his credentials. And I wrote 11, he had 11 elders at that church. I wrote 11 letters to each of the elders telling them my concern. I wasn't angry. I wasn't demanding that he resign. I never approached this as a way of being revengeful or hateful. It was all about my healing and then warning those around him. I wrote to 11 elders. I explained why I thought this was a dangerous place for this man to be, that it was inappropriate. I gave a little bit of my story. Not one responded back. So churches have a way of either ignoring you or trying to placate you. That's usually the two avenues that churches will choose. Right. And I don't mean this to be pastor bashing. I don't want this to be that, churches can't do the right thing, but so many don't do the right thing. And I don't know that it's always bad intention. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is strictly about protecting the reputation of the church instead of the integrity of the church. They should worry about the integrity and not the reputation. And I will tell church leadership, look, the outside world, if you would just come forward and say, we've had this happen in our church and we're going to handle it. People get that. What they don't get is why you cover it up. Yep. That's what they don't understand. It is a moral fall, but it's also an ethical violation. And so if we only deal with the moral aspect of it, then we get into forgiving them, giving them second chances. And the church can do that, but they cannot ignore the ethical violation, which means they have broken their ordination vows and they've proven by their own actions they're not fit for that position. It's not necessarily about punishment. It's about the integrity and safety of the church. So that's, and I know churches will say, well, we do background checks. Well, let me say this. My abuser, after multiple times of being involved sexually with a member of his congregation, would pass a background check because there's been no legal action taken against him. So while it's good to have a background check, don't let that be a security blanket because it's probably not as effective as you might think. So those are some of the ways of preventing. I know many churches now require that if you counsel with someone, you have someone in the room with you. There are windows in the doors, and those are all good. But I will also say these men are clever and they're very methodical and they're very patient. And so they find ways. And again, they will endear themselves to the congregation so much that people will not even see the red flags when they occur. Right. So when an incident of sexual abuse occurs, the first thing that needs to happen is to remove the pastor from his position at that point. Agreed. And we do not allow him to get up in front of the congregation and ask for forgiveness and say how sorry he was. It's not about him. It's about what was done to that victim. And if he's a manipulator and a liar anyway, do you not think he's not going to stand up and try to manipulate and continue to lie? Exactly. Why would he all of a sudden be this truthful, honest, wonderful person when he's proven who he is in the past anyway? So secondly, you need not to blame the victim in any way. I don't care what she did or didn't do or didn't say or said. He had the moral and the ethical responsibility to maintain the boundaries, not her. Right. It was his job to stay in those boundaries, not hers. And she had every right to expect that when she was with him, he would maintain those boundaries. So in no way is the victim to be blamed. And finally, we don't defend the offender.
Mhm.
So many at my church and would say, oh, but he did so many wonderful things. Or I know he made a mistake, but think about what he did. It doesn't matter what he did. You
Mhm.
need to focus on the actions and the immoral actions of his abuse. And that's where we look at the victim and we support the victim and we don't defend the offender in any way. So those are just a few things that I would say for churches.
Yeah,
Um,
those are great
and
guidelines. Yeah.
yeah, the other thing about victims with churches do, as I said earlier, two things. They want to placate the victim. They want to try to make her stay silent. They want to use the guilt issue and say to her, you don't want to hurt the church any more than it's already been hurt. Please don't talk about this anymore. Or they push forgiveness because they hope that forgiveness means she will then not make an issue of this. And it's not that victims want to make an issue. We just need to be able to tell our stories and have some justice. We want
Mhm.
justice and we want safety for the church. So,
Mhm.
and then finally, I keep saying finally, but finally,
No, you're
finally,
good.
I would say, be very aware when you're talking to victims of clergy abuse that things that you find comforting, like Bible reading and prayer, could be triggers for victims of clergy abuse. So
Mm.
don't suggest, I'll pray for you or let's pray together, because many victims have their perpetrators pray with them after having sex with them. They've heard the Bible in the pulpit, from the pulpit, these words of this man that they know is doing these evil things to them. So when someone says, this scripture might help you, it probably won't at that. Now, it doesn't mean in the healing process down the road, it can, but be
Mhm.
very sensitive to assuming the things that you find comforting with your Christian life and spiritual life will not be the same with a victim.
Mhm. Mhm. And how could people around them develop that awareness? Is there a way to approach it differently? Because will be a natural, I'm thinking a natural thing for Christians to say. Like, let's read through this passage. And it could be just anyone. I wonder if it's triggering not just from men, but is it also for anyone in general, like women as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would
Okay.
I would say when you've been sexually abused within the church, those are things that were contaminated. They were done in
Hmm.
evil. I mean, the Bible was quoted to me in a way that it twisted it. So
Hmm.
when I hear someone talk about this is what Scripture says, I want to say to them, I'll read it for myself. Not
Hmm.
it's a trigger. So here's what you can say to victims. This is the best thing you can do for a victim. The first thing you need to, when you find out someone's been victimized, whether it's clergy abuse or any other form of abuse,
Hmm.
this was not your fault. What happened to you was not your fault. So many victims blame themselves. I did. I spent years wondering, what did I do to encourage this person? Or what could I have
Hmm.
done to do it differently? So the first thing you say to a victim is, this is not your fault. And you can never say that enough. Secondly, you tell them, I want to hear your story if you want to tell me, and I'm going to believe you. Tell me as little as you want or as much as you want. I will listen. And you listen without judgment and you listen without questions. You just
Hmm.
let them tell their story. And you can sit there and be horrified, but you just want them to get those words out because so many victims cannot say the words, I've been sexually abused. And
Hmm.
then finally, I would say to the person who's listening to this victim, encourage them to talk about it to anyone else that can help them professionally. I mean, they
Hmm.
may need professional help and encourage them to do that. And it can be someone within the church, but it might be just as well to get someone outside of the church to
Hmm.
do. But
Hmm.
those are the ways you help a victim. You listen and you believe them, and then you tell them over and over it wasn't their fault.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, Sandy, this brought up a question because I encountered this with a student one time. The
Mhm.
student, so I'm a counselor, do some resident counseling, and a student was raped by a guy that she was dating, and then it had happened. This was like the third time that it happened with a different guy. And I said, we need to report this. Like I said, this is something that's big. Like we don't want this guy out there. And her response to that was, no, I don't want to make it a big deal. So when
Mhm.
it's something that does need to be reported or even brought to the attention of the church, like what's the role there? Because if someone doesn't want to share that or doesn't want to get out, the common, I think, perspective is they're going to take his side, which is true. I mean, this is what we're seeing. So they
Right.
may not want that information out there. How do we
Right.
navigate those waters?
Well, I think one of the things that you can do is verbalize to the victim
Hmm.
what they may be feeling that they can't express. So you say to that victim, I know you're afraid of no one believing you.
Hmm.
So the victim then says, okay, well, okay, she gets that, or he gets that. I believe you. I know you're afraid of what people will think. So, because that's a fear. I mean,
Hmm.
I didn't want to know this about me. I was, I thought that I was this beloved little girl in the church, and all of a sudden I'm having this affair, which it wasn't, with this
Hmm.
married pastor. So, all you can do is encourage a victim. Um, Victims feel a lot of guilt for not speaking up. So sometimes, and this is not to add guilt to them, but to encourage them to say, this is somehow that you can make something good come from this, because you're going to protect someone else down the road. So you can turn what was done to you into a positive by
Mm.
reporting. And that gives them a feeling of empowerment to some extent, that I'm
Hmm.
going to be someone else. It's not just about me. Um,
Mm.
but you can't push victims. I mean, it is,
Right.
I was silent for 27 years, and there was no way I was going to my grave with this. And had I
Mm.
not had that trigger, I probably never would have spoken about it. And even when I did, it took me probably 2 years before I finally convinced myself, or at least believed, that I was a victim, truly a victim, and this man never cared about me.
Mm.
Um, it was a 2 year process before I fully was able to come to that conclusion.
Mm. Wow. Yeah, we talk about the effects of something like this happening, and you mentioned that I can't go to church without feeling something about it. Is that just kind of part of life now, or is there something um, that you see just in churches that triggers that? Like, tell me about that a little bit.
I think it's basically a part of my life, but as I said earlier, the triggers are less.
Hmm.
I don't have them as frequent. And when I do, they're not as intense. Now, I just recently, a month ago, had a total anxiety attack at a funeral. There were
Mm.
some of the hymns that were very familiar to me. And started crying. I started to shake. My husband took my hand. I sat there thinking, I'm about to explode. And I thought, do I leave? But I knew if I got up, there was no way I was going to be able to walk calmly out of the church. I was going to have to run. And I thought, I can't do that. So I sat there, and just till it passed. I just held it in till it passed. And I talk about my experience in the sense that it's more of a sadness for me. I don't have a lot of anger. I do have anger, and I did in the beginning, but I understood that if I didn't let go of the anger, it was going to eat away at me, and it wasn't helping me in my life. I couldn't live the life I was leading if I was always angry at what he had done to me. So I let go of the anger a long time ago. But every now and then I will have this intense anger, and I had it that particular day. Um, I'll share this and you can decide what to do with it. But after this, we got out of the service at this church. We were in the parking lot, and we got into the car, and I fell apart and I started crying. And I said to my husband, I probably shouldn't say this in a church parking lot, but I hope he rots in hell. And which he said to me, that's okay. And I don't really, I feel that at times, but it's not really where I am in my life right
Sure.
now. I'm living the life I was meant to live. I will always have this abuse as a part of my life. It's always going to affect my life. It certainly has affected my spiritual life, but it doesn't define my life anymore. And
Mm.
that was how I was able to move on. And I hope that that will give hope to other victims, that it never goes away. And you're going to have triggers, and you're going to have reminders, but you can control those now instead of those controlling you.
Hmm.
Because for 27 years, that secret controlled me. It controlled every aspect of my life. And it
Right.
wasn't until I let go of it, until I began my healing process, that I was able to do what I'm doing today. I mean, I could have never envisioned this
Mm.
years ago, for sure.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. You mentioned church aspect, but how did this impact your view of God? I'm sure that was affected as well, because it
It,
happens in the church, and sometimes we make that direct connection to, if this happens at church, then God has some way
right.
involved in this.
So for me, I never blamed God. I never felt he was responsible, but I totally cut him out of my life for 27 years. As far as I believed he was there, but I didn't have any connection to him. Now, I was a person who had devotions every day. I read my Bible every day. I prayed every day. And then for 27 years, I had a Bible that sat on a bookshelf and was never opened, and I never prayed. My children never had a bedtime prayer with their mother. So I was very much disconnected. Once I was started my healing process, it went in stages. I began trusting God just a little bit more each time. And it's different. It's not that total trust, I would say, but it is a relationship I'm comfortable with. So many victims become atheist, or they find a different power to go to. So they find nature, or they find another, a totally different religion that was totally from their own religion. So every victim has different aspects, and some victims their faith becomes stronger, where they'll find themselves believing now that they are even closer to God. So I'm close to God. I read my Bible. I can pray. I don't like to hear someone else pray. But I, what I tell victims, I had one victim say to me, I don't believe in God anymore. And how do I handle that? And I said, well, let me just tell you, God knows what you've been through, and he's a pretty big God, and he understands. And you just take the time that you need to either find your way back, and maybe you don't. You don't want to put more guilt on victims, because they're not going to find healing that way. You can't say to a victim, you've got to believe in God, or God's your only way out of this. And that may be true, but to a victim who's been abused by someone within the church, that's not going to resonate with them, especially in the beginning. As I said, give them time. And if you've got someone who's going to listen to them, they'll start to trust that person to be able to share and open up to say, I don't know if I believe in God anymore. And don't react in horror, and don't try to say, okay, well, you've got to believe in God. That doesn't help at all.
Yeah, no, that's great advice, because sometimes it can feel like that. Like people want to help and don't know what exactly to say, and they want, it's interesting seeing how we engage that, but that's very helpful, not to push that on them, and that idea of giving them time.
Yeah, the good intentions are there, and I get why people want to do that. But if you're truly wanting to help a person of clergy sexual abuse, take it slowly in that area of spiritualness and spiritual life. And let the victim, can guide you. She may say, well, I believe this, but I'm not sure I believe that. And then you can pursue it as she or he, sometimes men, obviously, with the Catholic Church, that's been mostly, a lot of little boys and girls. And let me say, women are also abusers as well as men. It's not just men. I've come across many victims who were abused by Christian school teachers, nuns, and so it does happen from women to men and boys as well.
Yeah. Well, Sandy, thank you so much for sharing your story. I mean, obviously, it's one of those things that's hard for us to hear, but I just love hearing you talk about this and seeing where you are today, and using your story to help other women who are in similar situations. I wonder if you have any final thoughts for them.
Well, I will say to victims, remember, it's not your fault. Educate yourself. Learn the terms of grooming, gaslighting, manipulation, because all those things were done to you, and what was done was not your fault. And you did the best you could at the time with the coping skills that you had at the time and who you were. It's easy to look back and think you could have done something differently, but you couldn't. And to church leadership, I will say to you, please support these victims, because the church is meant to bring people into the church, not drive them away. And we don't need wolves in sheep's clothing as our shepherd. So I have a website, which I think you said you'll put up the link to that at the end of the show. And there's, as I said, you can go on many websites. You can Google clergy sexual abuse if you want to learn more about it. I am going to show you my book. This is my book that I wrote.
Kirkham. Let Me Pray Upon You by Sandy Kirkham.
Yes. And so, and my book's just one of many that I would recommend. And I do have a list in the back of my book, not only just for victims, but for church leadership as well.
Awesome. That'd definitely be a great resource. I'm looking forward to sharing that. We need to get the word out. And again, Sandy, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it and your testimony.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you again for tuning in today, guys. I really appreciate it. Your support means a lot to me, and I really look forward to doing these each and every week. If you would like to continue supporting the podcast, one of the things you can do is go to your Apple Podcast and find the Genesis of Shame there and then subscribe to it. That really helps it get some traction on the iTunes podcast and will allow this to be heard by many more people. You can also follow me on Spotify and other major podcast platforms. Thank you again, guys. Have a great day.